It was Christmas Eve, 2019, and I was staying at my grandmother's house for the holiday. She lived in a charming, old colonial home in rural Pennsylvania, a house that had been in our family for generations. It was the kind of place that creaked and groaned in the night, the sort of house where shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. I had always loved spending Christmas there. The fireplace crackled with warmth, the smell of pine from the fresh-cut tree filled the air, and every surface was decorated with garlands and twinkling lights. But this year, something felt different. Grandma hadn't been feeling well lately and had spent most of the day resting in her room upstairs. That left me alone to decorate the tree and prepare the house for Christmas morning. I didn't mind, I was used to being alone in the house, but as night fell, an odd sense of unease crept in. The first sign of something strange was faint at first. I was arranging ornaments on the tree when I heard it, the sound of bells. It was soft, almost melodic, like the jingling of sleigh bells, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the house. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor's decoration caught in the wind. But as I stood there listening, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the basement. The basement had always creeped me out. It was dark and cold, with stone walls and old wooden beams that made it feel more like a dungeon than a part of the house. Grandma stored her holiday decorations down there, and as a kid, I used to dread going down to retrieve them. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and there was always the sense of being watched. I told myself the bells were probably just a decoration I'd left behind when I brought up the Christmas boxes earlier. Maybe one of those old wind-up ornaments had started jingling on its own. Still, my stomach twisted as I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. The faint glow of the flashlight barely cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of dusty shelves and stacks of old furniture. The bells were louder now, echoing softly through the cavernous space. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. Of course, there was no answer. The sound seemed to be coming from the far corner of the basement, where an old wooden trunk sat against the wall. I approached slowly, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The jingling grew louder with each step, almost rhythmic, as if it were beckoning me closer. When I reached the trunk, I hesitated. It was large and ornate, with iron hinges and an intricate pattern carved into the wood. It had belonged to my great-grandfather, and Grandma had always told me never to touch it. The bells were louder than ever, coming from inside the trunk. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest, and reached for the latch. It was cold to the touch, and the sound of the bells seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. With a deep breath, I opened the lid. The trunk was empty. I stared into the dark void, my pulse racing. The bells had stopped abruptly, leaving the basement eerily silent. I shone the flashlight inside, but there was nothing, just the musty smell of old wood and dust. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. I jumped to my feet, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the basement, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps above me. Someone was walking through the house. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight and made my way back up the stairs, my legs trembling with every step. When I reached the door, I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. "Grandma," I called out, pounding on the door. "Are you there?" No answer. The footsteps moved through the house, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there was taking their time. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to listen. The sound was too heavy to be my grandmother, and my stomach sank as I realized she was still upstairs, probably asleep. The bells started again. This time, they were louder, echoing through the house like a haunting melody. The sound was coming from above me, from the second floor where Grandma's room was. My heart raced as I imagined her alone up there, unaware of what was happening. I had to get out. I searched the basement for another way out, but the small, high windows were sealed shut, their glass frosted over with years of neglect. The only option was the stairs. As I approached the door again, the footsteps stopped. The house fell silent, save for the faint jingling of the bells. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The hallway was empty, the air colder than before. I crept upstairs, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The bells seemed to follow me, their sound growing louder and more dissonant. By the time I reached Grandma's room, they were deafening. I pushed the door open, my heart in my throat. Grandma was sitting up in bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear them?" she whispered. I nodded, too scared to speak. "They always come on Christmas Eve," she said, her voice trembling. I thought they'd stopped. I thought they'd forgotten. Before I could ask her what she meant, the bells stopped abruptly. The house fell silent, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, from the hallway, came the sound of footsteps. They were heavier now, more deliberate, and they were coming straight for the room. Grandma grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let them in," she whispered. "No matter what you hear, don't open the door." The footsteps stopped outside the room, and the door rattled as if someone were trying to push it open. I braced myself against it, my heart pounding as the handle twisted violently. The bells started again, louder than ever, filling the room with their eerie chime. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. Grandma refused to talk about it the next morning, brushing it off as a bad dream. But I knew better. To this day, I can still hear those bells in my nightmares, and every Christmas Eve, I wonder if they'll come back. It was Christmas Eve, 2017, and I was house-sitting for my boss. She and her family had flown to Hawaii for the holidays, leaving me in charge of their sprawling suburban home and their excitable golden retriever, Max. It wasn't the most exciting way to spend Christmas, but the extra cash was too good to pass up. Plus, the neighborhood was beautiful, big houses, twinkling lights on every lawn, and a light dusting of snow that made everything look magical. The evening was quiet. I made myself some hot chocolate, curled up with a blanket, and started watching one of those cheesy Christmas movies. Max lay at my feet, snoring softly. The only sound was the occasional hum of the heater kicking in. I was just starting to relax when Max's ears perked up. At first, I thought he'd heard something outside, a squirrel, maybe, or a car passing by. But then he let out a low growl, the kind that made my skin prickle. He stood up and padded toward the front door, his tail stiff and his posture alert. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, pausing the movie. Max barked once, a sharp, warning sound, and stared at the door. My heart started to race. The neighborhood was supposed to be safe, but the sight of Max so on edge made me uneasy. I got up and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I shrugged it off and tried to calm Max down, but he wouldn't settle. He kept pacing between the door and the window, his growls growing more insistent. I checked the peephole again, then opened the door just a crack to look outside. The snow on the porch was untouched, but as I scanned the driveway, I froze. A set of footprints led from the street to the side of the house. They were fresh, the edges still crisp in the moonlight. I quickly locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. My mind raced through possibilities. Had the mailman made a late delivery? A neighbor stopping by? But it was nearly 10 p.m., and the tracks didn't lead back to the street. Whoever it was hadn't left. I checked the back door, then the windows, making sure everything was locked. Max followed me closely, his growls now punctuated by occasional whimpers. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. An hour passed, and I was just starting to calm down when Max's growls started again. This time, he was staring at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the glass. At first, I saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, a figure moved. It was faint, almost indistinguishable against the trees, but it was there. A person, standing completely still at the edge of the yard. My throat went dry as I tried to process what I was seeing. They were too far away to make out any details, but their posture was unnerving, rigid, unnatural. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" No response. The figure didn't move. I pulled the curtains shut and called 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation. The operator assured me that an officer would be dispatched immediately, but it would take some time due to the snowstorm. As I hung up, the lights in the house flickered and went out. The power outage plunged the house into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the snow outside. Max barked furiously, his barks echoing through the now silent house. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my pulse pounding in my ears. The front door rattled. I froze, the sound sending a jolt of fear through me. Someone was trying the handle, jiggling it as if testing whether it was locked. Max barked louder, his teeth bared as he lunged at the door. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, clutching my phone and listening. The house was silent except for Max's low growls and the faint sound of the wind outside. Then, from the living room, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I crept to the edge of the room and peeked through the curtains. A face stared back at me. It was pale and thin, pressed against the glass with a grin that sent a chill down my spine. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed directly on me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The face disappeared, leaving nothing but the faint imprint of condensation on the glass. I locked myself and Max in the bedroom, barricading the door with a dresser. I could hear movement outside the house, footsteps crunching in the snow, tapping on the windows, the sound of something scraping against the walls. When the police finally arrived, the noises stopped. The officers found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no one lurking in the yard. They assured me it was probably a prank, maybe teenagers messing around. But I knew better. The face I'd seen, the way it grinned at me, it wasn't a prank. I spent the rest of the night in the bedroom, clutching Max and praying for daylight. When the sun finally rose, I left the house without looking back. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was outside that night. But every Christmas Eve, when the snow falls and the world grows quiet, I hear it again, the soft knock on the window, and the faint sound of footsteps in the snow. It was Christmas Eve, 2018, and I had volunteered to stay at my sister's house while she and her husband took the kids to visit his parents out of state. They were due back the day after Christmas, and in the meantime, I would house sit and keep an eye on their dog, a spry little terrier named Toby. My sister's house was in a small, picturesque town in Vermont. It was a beautiful home, a two-story colonial with a big backyard that sloped into the woods. Snow blanketed the neighborhood, and every house on the street was adorned with twinkling lights and festive decorations. It felt like something out of a holiday postcard. I was looking forward to a peaceful evening, just me, Toby, and a stack of holiday movies. But by the end of the night, I was counting down the minutes until I could leave. It started innocently enough. Around 6 p.m., I took Toby outside to do his business. The air was crisp, and the sky was darkening into twilight. As we walked through the yard, I noticed something strange. There was a snowman standing at the edge of the property. It hadn't been there earlier. I'd arrived that afternoon, and the yard had been pristine, untouched except for the tracks I'd made unloading my car. The snowman was tall, at least 6 feet, with a crooked top hat and 2 mismatched branches for arms. Its face was made of small stones, arranged into a wide, unsettling grin. "Did the neighbors build you?" I muttered under my breath, half joking. Toby barked at the snowman, his ears flattening against his head. I tugged on his leash and brought him back inside, but the image of that crooked smile lingered in my mind. The first real sign of trouble came a few hours later. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, when Toby started growling. He was standing at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, his fur bristling and his tail stiff. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, setting down my mug of cocoa. Toby barked once, a sharp, nervous sound. I walked over to the door and peered outside. The snowman was still there, standing exactly where I'd seen it before. But something was different. Its head was tilted, as if it were looking toward the house. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, telling myself it was just my imagination. Snowmen don't move. It was probably the way the light was hitting it, or maybe I just hadn't noticed the angle of its head earlier. But Toby wouldn't stop growling. By 9 p.m., the unease had settled into a full-blown sense of dread. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but every little creak of the house made me jump. Toby had parked himself by the door, his eyes fixed on the curtains, his growls low and steady. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek outside again, my stomach dropped. The snowman was closer. It was standing halfway across the yard now, its crooked grin pointed directly at the house. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. There were no tracks in the snow to suggest someone had moved it, no sign of anyone at all. Just the snowman, closer than it had any right to be. I closed the curtains again and locked every door and window in the house. My hands were shaking as I double-checked the locks, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone messing with me? A neighbor playing a prank? Or was it something else? At 10:30, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the hum of the heater and the soft glow of the Christmas lights vanishing all at once. Toby barked frantically, his claws scrabbling at the door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtains back just a sliver and shone the flashlight into the yard. The snowman was right outside the window. Its face was inches from the glass, the stones of its grin pressed against the pane. The crooked top had cast a shadow over its hollow eyes, and the mismatched branches of its arms scraped lightly against the siding of the house. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Toby barked wildly, his small body trembling with fear. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick, and held it in front of me like a weapon. The snowman didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, frozen with terror. The snowman remained at the window, its grin mocking me, daring me to make a move. Then, slowly, it raised one of its branch-like arms and tapped on the glass. Knock. 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 I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty house. Toby bolted upstairs, his yelps fading into the distance. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I chose the latter. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my coat, and bolted for the front door. The yard was eerily silent as I stepped outside, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. I avoided looking at the window, afraid of what I might see. My car was parked in the driveway, and I fumbled with the keys as I hurried toward it. When I finally worked up the courage to glance back at the house, the snowman was gone. The yard was empty, the snow untouched except for my own frantic footprints. But as I started the car and backed out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the woods, just barely visible in the moonlight, the snowman stood, watching me. I didn't go back to my sister's house until she and her family returned. I didn't tell them what happened, either, it felt too absurd, too impossible to explain. But every Christmas Eve, when the snow falls and the world grows quiet, I find myself looking out the window, half expecting to see that crooked grin staring back at me. And sometimes, I think I do,